have several thoughts, but the little thing, the paper you're referring to is 1943, McCulloch and Pitts.
Right.
Yeah. With respect to the analog computers, as if they're they've gone the way of the dinosaurs. Actually, they're astonishingly successful. The entire Russian electronic warfare infrastructure is based on analog computers, and that's why they can work in electronic fog, while the digital computer is being used by Western military infrastructure simply get fried in exactly the same electronic fog. So those are simple points. But you raise some really serious points, and I want to come back to the idea. The idea of the metaphor. Hobbes tried to erase the metaphor from the English language. We don't have the subjunctive mood in the English language, or it's only used in a few archaic forms. And yet Planck said that science is impossible without the metaphor, because what is science? We're taking this vast, complicated universe and we're creating some mental image of it. That mental image is a metaphor. And if this mental image is useful, we develop it, and then at some point we try to test it against that vast, big universe and see if we can come up with something useful. But I think the essence of all of the AI, whether it's deep learning, whether it's symbolic logic, whether the various approaches, they are all very much in the atomist viewpoint of the universe. And what is the atomist viewpoint? If we go back to Democritus, it's you got a bunch of hard-shelled objects, which are just, in the words of LaRouche, percussioning. They're banging each other all the time, and supposedly the entire universe is supposed to come up with this, including flightless waterfowl. But I remember having a discussion with Eric Lerner, who wrote The Big Bang Never Happened.
Yeah.
And he recounted a conversation with the Belgian the man who did thermodynamics and chaos. Prigogine, that's right. So Prigogine was telling him that if there is a finite basement to the universe, with a bunch of, whether it's at the ether level or it's below or whatever, if there is a finite basement to the universe of particles, then thermodynamics doesn't work. It simply, thermodynamics simply collapses. In other words, there is no basement to the universe. There is no, and so this is exactly what you were saying with respect to meaning, which is what we are describing. There is no absolute basement at which you can write down definitions. Always your definitions, your notion of meaning will always be relative. And so you're always socially situated in your search for meaning. But let's come back to the brain. The brain, in the atomist viewpoint, is this, here supposedly the junctions of the 0-1 transforms and so on and so forth. Now, as you described, it's far more complicated than that. My son works as a medical researcher in Brussels, and he was telling me that they now know that cells communicate, even if they don't touch.
Yes.
Even if they do not touch. So they're literally, and then of course this communication can be chemical. In other words, chemical objects are passing from one cell to the other, or they can be electronic. And of course the electronic is virtually instantaneous in comparison to the chemical transformations. So in fact, the entire brain is continually interacting with itself instantaneously. And so there's absolutely nothing remotely related to a computer in this vision. And we don't even know if the thinking actually takes place inside the physical case of the brain, because after all, you can measure electronic signals way beyond the actual physical presence, or the visible physical presence. And when two people come to interact, often my wife and I come up with identical thoughts at identical times. So there clearly has to be some sort of interaction between our thinking processes. Mm-hmm. So if there's anything that I commented upon that you want to respond, sure. I'd be happy to listen.
I'm a great fan of analog computing. I think that is really also a big future. There's a guy in Germany, I think, who does a lot of contract work with analog computers. But I think it's going to really take off because they were used like the differential analyzer and some of that were used for ballistic calculation. Calculation is somehow a funny word because it wasn't with numbers. It's a continuous, you have a physical system. It's like I've been saying on the IBM they're trying to sell their supercomputer time and looking for problems that they can use it on. So one of them is protein folding, predicting the conformation of a protein. I said, well, but why don't you just let the protein fold and then see what happens, right? So in this sense, the natural process is the analog, is the computer, but it folds without computing. We don't see any numbers flying around, right? So anyway, I think that analog computing will explode because we have the technology to do things that you couldn't do before. The analog computers became, anyway, that's a whole story. But there was one really important point. Oh yeah, on the cells, I think a very important point I didn't mention is that neurons are little organisms. Right? And we know from amoebas, from all kinds of single-celled organisms, the neuron is not independent in the same way that, let's say, a ciliated bacteria is, or something like that. But single-celled organisms show directed behavior, willful behavior, purposeful behavior, learning, at least something analogous to learning, communication. Also, an amoeba, I mean, every cell is more complicated than any technical system the human being has ever even dreamed of. How is that all coordinated? You have every second, I don't know, 10 to the 9 chemical reactions. Look at an amoeba. It's sort of a semi-anarchistic, it's a fantastic organism. So now you look at that, where's the nervous system? No nervous system. You look at a lot of these animals that show very purposeful, very organized behavior. Plants, no nervous system, but they respond in a lawful way. We know now they have also an electrical signaling system and so on. So, but here's where you get to an interesting point. The biologist, I'm talking biology because I'm dealing with biology a lot at the moment. That's maybe part of the way that our scientific culture functions at the moment. Is we think of mechanisms. We say we have magnetic fields, we have electric fields, we have electrical impulses, we have chemicals, right? So we have in our mind an array of things you were talking about. Yeah, the things are not necessarily out there in some sense. It is conceivable you would have a science later that would have different concepts, be describing the same thing. But it often happens. You can describe everything in electrodynamics in terms of interactions. There's the Weber electrodynamics. You don't need the fields. Mathematically, you don't. right? In other words, one must, I think, always be aware that we impose certain concepts on what we're looking at, and not be afraid of doing that, because we don't know any other way. We have our language, we have our words, but what you said, I think, is very important, that through metaphor, we can get out of the limitations of a set of concepts that have gotten worn out or sclerotic, and to recover meaning, or to address additional meaning. These are things that are, how should I say, in a sense, independent of what neurophysiology tells us and something. These things that we experience immediately ourselves. So that's what I would just say. In a search for meaning, in a sense, I think that in the basement of the universe, I think Prigogine and others, the physicists, had problems of exactly the type I'm mentioning. It's what is called occupational illness. I'm very favorable. I've become more conservative in a certain way. I'm very favorable to doing any of these things, using formal logic, using this, as long as you understand. And also, if we're looking at the brain, you say, well, you have these electromagnetic. Yeah, but if you want to actually study a process, you tend to narrow it down. You have certain instruments that you can use. You measure things. You can only look, so to speak, where there's light. You can only do the investigations which your technology permits you to do. So, and therefore you exclude a lot of stuff. We do that all the time, right? You simplify, you do simplistic things. Otherwise we wouldn't be where we are. We wouldn't have any technology, right? A machine is something that you build to operate in a specific way. So you enslave nature in such a way that you simplify a process, like a computer, right? You prevent it. You want a computer, you don't want your computer sloshing around like an amoeba, right? So anyway, I'm just saying all this in a sense that we're in this, what do you call in German, Spannungsfeld. We're in this ambiguous situation where we're limited in our use of language, but we have a way of transcending that, as what you said, by metaphor. And if you look at the German language as a scientific language, and the way Max Planck, for example, or Schrödinger is a good example, is struggling with a process that's not fitting into the categories that he had, invents a term like Wellenmechanik, wave mechanics. Right? But mechanics, classical mechanics, has nothing to do with waves. Right? So he invented a metaphor, essentially, in a struggle to create something at least as a vehicle for scientific communication. By itself, wave mechanics doesn't really mean anything. Right? So anyway, and if you look at Schrödinger's later attempts to struggle with this problem, or Einstein and so forth, it works very much through this metaphorical. I think what you said is very important. This constant use of metaphor, and in a certain sense, the English language has certain pluses and minuses. One thing that's very good about the English language is that usually the verb is early in a sentence. And other things, something you can hit some things like that, but you lose sometimes the poetry. Anyway, I don't want to go on.
And the poor interpreter, a verb, please give me a verb.
The interpreter is asphyxiated.
Okay, next up in queue, we have Bob, then Anton, Stephen, and Fletcher. So Bob,
I got it.
By the way, Jonathan, do you have a time frame of when you have to cut out?
Oh, I've turned in my article, so I'm free. Free.
That's exactly what I wanted to hear. Okay, good. So Bob, go for it.
Okay, so I've got a million things, but I'll try to limit what I want to say to just a few. First of all, on this issue of language, there's a couple of very interesting recent articles that have come up on the. I'm looking at an article right now that's about Google Assistant, something multilingual BERT, B-E-R-T, and it says it translates 100 languages simultaneously.
Hey, sorry, Bob.
Yeah.
Are you in a position to turn on your camera by chance or no? If not, that's okay.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I can. I'm sorry. Let me turn it on. Let me see here. I can do that. There we go. Am I on? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So anyhow, I'm looking at this article. It's about the fact that they really don't even understand how this thing works. That this translation, they're feeding all these different languages into it. And now somebody's trying to come up with a vector model that's going to show a point for a word. And that somehow they're going to generate a grammar out of that. That's one article. And that's there. There's another article which is very, very similar about an algorithm at Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory that applies machine learning. And what these guys are saying there, it's a guy named Chin, that he fed data from past observations into the from orbits of Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, and Jupiter. And he wants to see if the laws of motion and gravity can be generated by the information that he's feeding into this deep learning network. So it's kind of exactly what you're talking about, where it is stupid because they're expecting this deep neural networks to come up with a theory which is human. And it's kind of amusing, in fact, that they're even attempting all this stuff. That's one thing. Another couple things. You mentioned this thing about, I'm looking at biophysics myself quite a bit. And I think the model that I'm always going back to is Leibniz's monadology for what, like, for example, proteins. That proteins can operate from a standpoint of very much of a window on the world in terms of their communication, which Leibniz called a window on the world. He was prescient in that regard because he wasn't looking at an atomistic model at all with his monadology whatsoever. It had nothing to do with Democritus per se. And from the standpoint of, for example, the proteins, you can go, I'm looking at two of how Riemann's model of surfaces, that you can look at a protein, for example, as being a singularity in a multi-dimensional surface, whereby it can function on different levels at the same time. Proteins themselves are not multivalent, single valent. They can function, and they're called moonlighting proteins in whole different ways. And there's all these connections that we understand very, very little about. And beyond that, there's another aspect I think that Riemann is very important, which is a shockwave propagation paper. And from the standpoint of new degrees of freedom being created, if you have a medium, and it could be a biophysical medium, wherein you move that system beyond what it's capable of transmitting within that system, in the same way that you move a sound wave beyond the speed of sound. And by doing that, you create a new singularity. And I believe that, for example, neurogenesis, which you mentioned previously, has a lot to do with what Riemann was talking about when he's talked about thought masses. That has to do with neurogenesis in particular, for humans, not for regular mammals, for example. They do have neurogenesis too, but humans have neurogenesis of a particular kind. New ideas, new thought masses that actually move society ahead. If you look at society itself in terms of the historical development of new ideas that have moved society ahead, it's of that sort. So anyhow, that were my couple of comments there.
Well, thanks. Yeah. Just one. I have a couple of PowerPoints, but I didn't want to. Maybe later I can show one of these, or you can find it in the one of the Asia Times articles on the adversary examples. Which is really a wonderful thing, which is you can take these image identification programs that will take an image and they'll say, this is a cat, right? This is a truck, and so on. And then you can, clever people understanding how these systems are organized can take for example, a picture of a frog. The one I have is a frog, and slightly change it by adding in such a way that the human eye doesn't see any difference. And then the program will say, and the computer will look at, the AI system will look at what we see as a frog clearly and say it's a screwdriver. How can that happen? That is one of the examples where you begin to see that the system is working on a completely different principle. It's cheating, right? And now you have an additional problem with that, which is a big problem in which people in AI are concerned about. And that is, when such a mistake is made, how can you correct it? When you analyze, and this is very technical then, it's a little different from the symbolic AI where you can say, well, this equation was wrong. But in the deep learning, you have a structure which is constantly being modified of coefficients and so forth. It has no intelligible structure. Right? So you can't say, well, that was where the problem was. So therefore, you can't correct these systems.
Right.
Right? So, and this is a very, very big problem. So I just wanted to mention that because it's an example of this. When scientists apply AI, which is of course really in, again, there's money coming out of these pipelines and you want to get it connected into your faculty, right?
String theory.
So they work a lot with AI. And it can be also very, for example, climate patterns. Get AI to study, identify climate patterns. It's fine with me. I think it's wonderful. The only question is, are we understanding anything about climate and the weather through that? Well, it could be useful or not as a tool, right? But then it gets very subtle, and you have to. It's like anything you do when you plot a curve or you do anything else using any tool. Since AI has such a reputation, you can publish a lot of papers by saying, I used AI to do X, Y, Z. It's the same thing with quantum computers. All you have to do is say quantum, and people say, wow, right? Because nobody understands what it is. Quantum computer, and my God. Right. So anyway, that's what I would say. I think with the monads, I would only, that's another huge topic. But I will only say that it took me at least 30 years, maybe longer. I can't remember when I first read Leibniz, but it's at least 30 years, maybe 40 years, to even get an idea what he meant by saying the monads have no windows. No windows,
Right.
right? This is a very important thing. People don't want to, what does he mean by that, right? So anyway, I don't want to talk about that. I just wanted to mention that is, to me, it is so far away from the usual way of thinking about things. Has nothing to do with atoms in space or anything. It's a completely different, you're in a different world. That it's much, much closer to Husserl's phenomenology. That it's so far away from our usual way of thinking about things that it's one of these areas where the human mind does something which we don't have any analog of, right? What you were saying. Maybe you want to think of it in terms of a shock wave. I think it's non-algorithmic. That is to say, you can't say this happened and then this happened, right?
Right.
You have well, I don't want to try to put words onto it, but it has nothing to do with a process which is developing from step 1 to step 2 in time. And then I say, okay, now I know what a monad is, right? I'm a living human being, right? I didn't come from a tabula rasa, right? And something happens where you get a moment of insight, where you can't necessarily identify what happened right before that. Right? Well, these are phenomena which are very, very interesting and have no analog in this algorithmic, and we are very much bound by that because that's one of the few. When you start in science to try to understand, when you want to make a machine, you want to know what it's doing, right? It's not that you want to be mechanistic in your thinking, but if you want to build a machine, you want to do what it's going to do. You want to build a rocket that's going to go to Mars, and you say, well, this happens, this happens, this happens. So you have a certain occupational hazard that in the development of technology, we think in certain ways for reasons which are not the full, capacity, but for a good reason. You want to sit and daydream when you should be building a rocket, right? You do your. So anyway, that's what I would say to that one.
I think that sets the stage pretty nicely for what Anton is thinking about. Anton, go for it. Stage is yours. You're on mute though.
Great to see you.
I fear Anton might have.
There we go.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
Hello, Jonathan. I haven't seen
Hi, great to see
you in a
you.
million years.
Yeah.
You still look the same, though. You look like you're about 30 years old with gray hair.
Gray hair, yeah, that's it.
I wanted to ask what you thought about the concept of the divine. People who were fully engaged in trying to move society forward with science and with improvements, had a concept of that the essence of man was divine, and none of these people were church, bound by any church, but they had, so they weren't going to define that. As you pointed out, you can't define anything that important. But one of them, Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles, in his book Zoonomia, talked about that God imparted animality to what was there, and endowed nature with the propensity to improve itself. And so this involves a divine purpose, but we're not going to say what that purpose is, but there is that divine purpose. And so in human beings, maybe it's certainly associated with passion and emotion, somewhere in there, you're obviously from any basement to things,
Yeah.
right? So, but do you have anything you've thought over about the idea of the divine and what that means with so both the nature, I guess, the mind, and also the idea of progress in nature and man, but particularly the mind in its highest form. What would you say about the notion of the divine? I don't expect any theory or anything, but just anything you have to say might be very good.
Yeah, well, you got me a bit unprepared on that one. Well, firstly, I would say that before, well, just personally, I'd say my sort of present track is in a certain way to come back to these kinds of issues, or issue is not the right word. But sometimes it's a good idea to start from a different standpoint. I, grew up in a certain Jewish tradition, the Old Testament. I'm not a big, not big religious. Religion was not a big deal in a certain sense, but the Bible and the creation and man in the middle, man in the middle of a specific relationship with man and God as a I don't want to say a man-like entity, a personality that people could communicate, even talked to people. So very, very, what do you call, there's a word for this. You could say man in the image of God, or God in the image of man, anyway. And now I'm saying, okay, well, let's look at it in a very different way. Try to come back to that. Or maybe not come back to that. Maybe you end up somewhere else, right? But loosen that up. And say, well, firstly, okay, man is unique. I look around me at all these living things. I look at the universe and say, wait a minute, I'm surrounded by intelligence. I'm surrounded by the evidences of intelligence, of creation, in the sense that I create things, beautiful things. I look at a fly. I look at the galaxies. I say, wait a minute, the whole universe, I'm not a stranger to this universe, but I see all around me. How do you know that somebody's intelligent? Well, you know from what they do. If they can't talk, you see other ways, expressions of intelligence, right? I see it everywhere. Not only in human beings, it's all over. It's not some, so now that's one aspect. That there's a certain universality. So we get a little bit away from this, firstly, uniqueness of man. I'm not saying I'm against it.
Yeah.
What I mean by uniqueness is we are individuals, and it's all, we're not somehow in a soup. We are individuals, so there's an individuation. But the individuation is an individuation in a world which is full of humanness, we could say, full of humor, so for example, animals. I think that animals have creative mentation in a certain sense. I don't think there's some sort of a wall that separates animals from human beings. Well, look at children. They love animals. They immediately relate to animals as this idea that it comes then later on. Right? In other words, I believe that animals would be much more intelligent, but they rather eat. They like eating. That's a big deal for animals, also for human beings. I'm joking a little bit, but human beings that are only focusing on eating are also generally not, you don't get much creative mentation out of them. So it's all kind of humor. What I'm trying to say is, when we talk, the divine has many shades to it, because there's a moral characteristic of the divine, which is a little bit different. But, and one would want to get to that from this idea of that we are in this, intelligence, not the right word.
I understand.
We are in a loving universe.
Mm-hmm.
We are in a wonderful universe. Oh. The smallest fly, the smallest cell is unbelievable. It's beyond anything you could imagine. The reality, or whatever we want to call reality, is beyond everything. You study anything in the universe, you find more. And everything's organized. Everything is in a certain sense purposeful. Maybe it doesn't look that way, right? And it all works out in such a way, well, I don't know exactly how evolution occurred, but I see its products, whatever it was. Well, I see the products of incredible fruitfulness and creativity. Didn't come from me, it's there. Right? So there are all these things. So it's a kind of a, you could say it's a kind of a emotion that goes with that, right? In other words, when we're talking about the divine, I believe, again, we're getting away from artificial intelligence, but I think when you're talking about the divine, you cannot, it's not an intellectual concept in some, it's an emotional concept.
Mm-hmm.
It's also not a feeling, right? Because it has a content, which a mere feeling doesn't really have. You know, I'm afraid of something, not like that. So it is something that fills the personality, or can fill the personality, and the nature of this, as I say, is we are submerged in this, where all of these characteristics, the humor, the irony, the metaphor, I can see this also in animals in a certain way. It's not like you say, it's not there the same way in human beings as, but it's not absent.
Yeah.
Right? It's not absent. So therefore, yeah. So therefore, when we say we're thinking, we're using our mind and so forth, thinking is, if we get away from the, I don't know what you want to say, dried out, more formalistic, or more I can't find the right word. And we see that we're talking about we're talking about a form, a developed form of something which is universal. Then, yeah, I don't know. I think this is, again, one of the primitive concepts, as meaning is. Gödel had this notion that you can't communicate the primitive terms. In other words, you can't, it's not something you can communicate. You can evoke, maybe. You can give an occasion. You can tickle somebody. Say, as the poets would do, to give them a sense of awe. That's another aspect of it, right? Divine, the awe. What I said, it's so much. You look at. We don't see the stars nowadays because it's too much light. You look up at that and you say, "My God, what hypothesis, right?
Yeah.
You would never, so I think those are things which, and then there's the ways in which in human culture, this kind of, I don't want to call it experience, whatever now, there's no word that really fits it, right? Comes to a certain expression. You have a word, divine, right? You have certain practices, right? Which are developing, yeah. So you have this notion, which I sort of, to me, catches always in my mind. It's not from the Old Testament, I think. The notion of God's word, the word. You have an expression of something, right? You're always you're dealing with an expression, not with the expressor. You're dealing with it with an expression. So you look around and you say, my goodness, I see the expression of intelligence, right? I don't see the bearded God up on the throne, right? But I see the word, I see a word. And then you say, okay, the human being has a very special characteristics, right, obviously. Anyway, that's as much, I don't know, in our culture, I think this was, I think Bob referred to this. There is, in our particular historical period, a fixation on combinatorics with the digital age.
This is my granddaughter who's having her birthday, and she just called me.
Oh, okay.
Talk about the divine, right? Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, please, happy birthday. Yeah, great.
Bye.
Yeah,
See you, Anton.
Bye.
Thanks. You know, what you were saying just brought a little memory. Back in 2009, I was at a Darwin conference celebrating his birthday, and one of the lead speakers was describing all of these weird phenomenon of different bird species in the Galapagos Islands that had evolved like blue legs, and like twice a day this one species would put its neck up into the sky and make some interesting sound. And they were trying to find some mechanistic necessity for everything, and they couldn't figure out why this would have evolved with this impulse to like make this sound and have these blue legs. And rather than entertain the possibility that there was aesthetics in nature, or like you said, why not? Yes, birds sometimes make sounds to communicate information, but why not also just because they want to have fun, or they're being playful, or that these things are. They just brushed all that aside, and they just said it's proof that ultimately the universe is irrational and does things for whatever, and just moved on and ignored all of that information.
This notion of rational is, I mean, Darwin, the very little, that's also a thing which I think one should not necessarily go too far in putting people in the categories of the good guys and the bad guys. In many ways, Darwin was not a Darwinist. In this sense, you had a tradition of the naturalists, the people who studied nature, not some theory, or that maybe he had a theory, but he entertained a lot of different hypotheses, was in contact with Humboldt, and there was some kind of disagreements and so on. Anyway, he observed a lot of things, as any good naturalist does. Independently of the theory, whatever theory. I think it's what you say is right. One of the really big problems, again, is this notion that everything happens out of necessity, right? And the idea that if you would let go of that notion of necessity, then you would become totally irrational and what's the word? Arbitrary. So there's nothing in between iron necessity and anarchy. Old problem for human beings, right? So that you could have birds that have fun. They sing because they like to sing. Right? Doesn't fit in the categories. Yeah, but we immediately realize as human beings, yeah, when a child is singing and they love to sing, right? Isn't that the same thing? Yeah, right? Should we say the child is not doing it because the child has fun? Then we turn all these concepts into nothing. We destroy all the concepts. So I've told people, I had a meeting here at the beginning of this work with the artificial intelligence, this project of mine, I can't remember how I did it. I put out some kind of an invitation. Oh yeah, an invitation to a group that I was involved in that had philosophical discussions. There's this philosophical discussion groups here in Berlin. And some of them, and I said, found a topic. And then the people that came were all total nerds, but some really good nerds, that they were very sharp. And so I began my criticism of artificial intelligence and so forth. And I got nowhere. I hit a brick wall. In a sense, I wanted to have that because I would learn, it would force me to learn a lot of things, to realize what the problem is. And I got already at the beginning, I hit the brick wall. I said at the beginning, the universe is very large and mathematics is just a tiny, tiny little piece. What? What do you mean? We can model everything. So everything can be modeled, everything. So we have our mathematics, and with this mathematics, we can put the whole universe in this mathematics. And these people like von Neumann and Turing and so forth had this occupational hazard. They were so successful, so brilliant with their mathematical models. Norbert Wiener, modeling the nervous system, understanding the control feedback mechanisms, they say, in the living. They were very fascinated with biology. Tremendous. But is that everything? So anyway, I hit the wall on this, and I came back and said, well, but it was an attempt to first get people out of their bubble, and it failed. It failed miserably. And I haven't since then actually succeeded, although I got one of them into a longer process, who agreed and actually knows more than I do on this big issue that's in artificial intelligence, whether there has been progress on so-called general artificial intelligence or not. In other words, universal artificial intelligence, where not for a specific purpose, but a system that would learn and become like a human being. And he agrees with me that the amount of progress is equal to 0. And everybody that says, and he's an AI person, he's a serious AI person, and there are others that take this position, that basically the original ideas of the great masters, that it's all basically a bluff, it's useful, so on, but it has nothing to do with the original idea. Right. So on that level, I'm able to communicate. So anyway, yeah, but I would prefer to say that it's ridiculous to try to reduce something like happiness to information. And happiness is a primary, it's not something reducible to something else, right? Yeah. You could say it's a little bit atomistic, but it's not really atomistic because there's no sort of boundary to happiness where you can say, you know, it's this blob. Anyway, that's my sort of way of take on that now.
Thank you. I know, Stephen, you've been waiting. Fletcher is after Stephen. Then we have three more names after that, and we should probably cut it off after. Anyway, let's get Stephen, go for it.
Okay, thanks, Matt.
Okay.
Jonathan, given the nature of the audience here, I feel like I should thank you not only for your wonderful discussion, but for the fact that you didn't use me as a study subject for your inquiry into the nature of stupidity. So my gratitude for that. Bearing in mind that I am very much an amateur in your field and all that, I'd like to play on your thought on the imperfection of physics, as well as how can we make artificial intelligence when we don't actually understand what intelligence really is. In your research and learning, have you dealt with the concept of non-locality of consciousness? And has anyone thought or explored the possibility that I believe it's a Russian concept of torsion physics, might be the describe the physics, if you will, that bridges from the local to the non-local in that regard?
Yeah. I'm still back at I haven't gotten past the 1920s in my thinking about physics in a certain way, because the development of quantum physics, which includes this element of non-locality, is the first place where this exploded into the domain of physics. The question about whether the influence of one event on another one propagates, through a material medium like a sound wave, or whether in some sense, there is an effect which does not involve a medium, a coupling, which does not involve something that goes between the two.
Spooky forces at a distance.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Although you could say that. Right. Yeah, right. And the trouble I have with this is that I'm actually working on this problem now, but it's one of the main things that I'm struggling with again and again, is the difficulty. I mean, when you get to torsion, all of these things, there's a big accumulation of physical theories. The conventional ones, the so-called accepted ones, mainstream, which fortunately in this area are not unique. The quantum physics is one of the areas where happily, and exactly also in our period, there are fundamental discussions, different points of view, which have not been settled and have not arrived at a consensus. And I'm very happy about that, because that's lacking in certain other areas. But the difficulty with a lot of this is that it requires, I think, a degree of conceptual rigor, which is very difficult to attain. And I speak as somebody who I'm struggling to attain it. And without having that, you're basically just swimming around. You're basically, you could have, I can make a long list of these different approaches to physics, and the Russians are tremendous at this also. There are torsion physics, there are a lot of the other ones, I've forgotten the names of them. And I'm not saying they're wrong. What I'm saying is they don't get at, they're in a sense not rigorous on the most fundamental. They're trying to solve something. They're trying to solve a paradox without really facing where the paradox is coming from. For example, when I say non-locality, what do I really mean? How would I test that? If for example, I don't want to go into this whole thing. It's very difficult. Also, from a standpoint, you could take a different standpoint, which I have, namely to say, well, what's wrong with that? What's so strange about that? Why does so-called why does the idea that two processes might be linked to each other, although they're far apart, without a communication with one another? What's so strange about that? Because if you have a monological standpoint, every process has the whole universe holographically. No, there never were two processes that were separated from each other. There never were. There were never two isolated, as far as we know. There were never two isolated systems in the universe. Everything was always together. Only one universe. Therefore, either you believe in the idea that you can cut off one piece of the universe from another and isolate it totally, or you have to accept that there's a correlation between everything that's happening in one place and another, right? Without, So then you get to a very ironic thing. Okay, fine. Now, how do I explain the propagation of an effect? Why do I have to talk to somebody? Why do I talk to somebody? Maybe you have to explain that. So I'm not giving theories. I'm simply saying that it was realized by some people, Einstein was a bit open to this, that the difficulty involved was not physics per se. Again, you have I'm very interested in the Bohm quantum interpretation of quantum mechanics. Very, very interesting, and it's coming back, which is the Bohm so-called guiding wave. Well, anyway, this is not our subject here. But so this is what I would say. We're getting at things that are not, what you get into, I think is to get a better grip on how we should be thinking about the universe. What do we mean by a theory? What do we expect to have? Right? When you ask a question, you generally also want to have an idea of what kind of an answer you're looking for. Right? What do you want to do with it? That's also always a kind of a measuring rod in physics, with good reason. To say, okay, well, make something work with it. When I want to stop with this, I'm very interested also in high temperature superconductivity, which also poses very, very interesting. I got to know one of the physicists who disagrees with the so-called BCS theory of superconductivity. This is a big deal, because if we could make the superconductors, if we could make good superconductors that would work at room temperature, this would be a tremendous revolution. Anyway, but very interestingly, the issue of high temperature superconductivity does touch on fundamental issues in quantum physics. So there's an overlap there, and so I think that's the social process of science, right? You have these areas where you have applications, then you have an area which is much more reflective, which discriminates between tools that are useful, artificial intelligence, tools that are useful, and this area of meaning and reflection, to get new concepts, to get a better reflection on the limitations of the concepts that we're using, as opposed to what the Russians were doing, putting the concepts together in another way, if you know what I mean. Which can be also, physicists do that. They play with the concepts, say, okay, this equation is no good. I make a better equation. I introduce another particle, right? There are not enough particles. I introduce a new particle. There were gluons, there were so on. Okay, fine, but that's in a certain conceptual domain. It might work, it might get us further, but it doesn't get us necessarily further to better concepts, right? So this is, so anyway, that's the way I'm looking at it. I think it's enough.
Okay, Fletcher, your time has finally come.
Okay.
Try to go on like this.
Good. Quick animal story. I was at the farm market and I meet this guy who has an Afghan hound, and they're very rare. And so I said to the guy, I heard that Afghan hounds, because they operate independently, they are among the most intelligent dogs of the dogs and the least trainable. I said, is this true? So he says, well, let me tell you what happened 2 weeks ago. He said, I heard Molly at the front door barking her head off. And I ran to the front door to see what was happening outside. And by the time I got there, she had gone the other way through the living room and dining room and grabbed my sandwich off the counter in the dining room.
Yeah.
So anyway, if you took one of these Google machines and presented it with the problem of your presentation today, it could probably do a fairly mediocre job of translating some of what you said. But it could never have predicted coming into the room what you were going to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with these algorithms, the algorithmic view, is that it completely messes up the relationship between time and causality.
Mm-hmm.
Because in an algorithm, the inputs come from the past, the algorithm is the present, and it spits something out.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not how the mind works.
Mm-hmm.
The human mind lives in the future. The human mind has a concept, an analog, a model of the outside world. And at every moment, it is considering myriad possible courses of action and evaluating the effect of those actions or alternatives on the outside world.
Mm-hmm.
And it's different from person to person, but has some idea of what are desirable outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And the model may be more or less effective, it may be more localized, and so forth. But everything it does, hopefully the model is an effective model. I mean, that's some of what Leibniz addresses in the monadology. You are actually reflecting the real world that's outside, and you're causing things to happen. One of the interesting things is the relationship between the mind and the brain going back the other way.
Mm-hmm.
You walk in here, your jaw opens and closes, your tongue moves, your teeth move, you breathe out, you contract your larynx, and certain words come out. Those are obviously occur in a physical and biological universe.
Mm-hmm.
But somehow the idea that you came in with is what actually directs the sequence of words and ideas that you present. So, and I think very vaguely in my mind, because, a lot of times when you're trying to solve a problem, you have this idea of what are the necessary aspects of the solution, but you don't have a solution. Right? And again, you would use analogs. Well, I was in a situation where I made a mistake and I got things wrong because I didn't take, something else into account. Those are the kinds of things you apply, to start to form on the other side of the dark glass.
Right.
What an actual creative solution to the problem is. But somewhere in this in this process is a place in which the human mind works on the brain and transmits to it. I know Leibniz had this formulation of a predetermined harmony that I've never felt very comfortable with. I don't know whether it's the concept and the way he presents it or my inadequacies. right?
Yeah,
This
yeah.
always seemed very strange to me. But somewhere in there, I'm sure that things that from uh, a strictly physical standpoint would appear to be random are now determined. Why this electron makes this transition at this point, because
Mhm.
it's necessary for what has to happen in the future. And the point is, the future is acting to pull forward your mind, to pull
Mhm.
forward your brain,
Mhm.
to move your body, and that's and that can never happen in one of these algorithmic machines.
Well, if I may just comment on that, I would just say what my experience was, again, one of these AI types will take what you said and say, aha, that's exactly what we do with our AI. We have our computer that tests out future possibilities, right? And finds the optimum one and does exactly what you said. Yes, exactly. Anticipates the future. And if you, now you'll say, well, no, and you'll say something else and they'll take that. Ah, yeah, we'll put that in our scheme, right? I would, obviously there's a characteristic which you were implying, namely that the future is not a combination of the past.
Mm-hmm.
So the artificial intelligence system, since it works algorithmically, can only combine, in some sense, the past.
Mm-hmm.
It has no way to do anything else than to project, so reflexively plan the future on the basis of modeling it. And from modeling the future on the basis of the past to say, oh, well, that's now what I want to do, something like that, yeah. I think, though, there's one, I would take this notion of coherence, which is a little bit Leibniz's idea, is that there may be things which don't happen for any reason in the ordinary sense, but they happen because, and that's always a question, what do you mean by because? They happen in such a way that if they didn't happen in the way they're happening, the universe would be absurd. In other words, they're neither determined by the past nor the future, nor sideways, left or right, up and down.
Mm-hmm.
But they are like when an artist puts something in the painting, right? Because it's the only thing you can do, or Beethoven will make a note because it's the only note which is the right one, right? And there can be a kind of determination of that sort, yeah, that we can't, we can have a feeling for, right? You can have a feeling for why a certain decision was the right one, which you couldn't have known at the time you did it. It was not a reasoning, what we call feeling, right? Or whatever. We try to put a label on it, of something which is, yeah, which seems to work. One other thing I would just say, this is, I did some work about Breuer. Breuer was a doctor who worked with Freud and did the first work with Freud, and very famous patient, a woman. It's actually a very interesting person. And Breuer was a fantastic thinker, I think vastly beyond Freud, very, very cultivated and so on. I wrote an article about it. It's unfortunate, it's in German, but if you read German, you can read. And there I looked at the background of Breuer, and now I can't remember who it was. There was a whole series of these German philosophers who were thinking about exactly this issue, the mind and Breuer. And one of them had this beautiful metaphor. And he said that the brain, or when we study the brain and the mind, it's like we're looking at a sphere from the inside or from the outside. We're looking at the same thing. You're looking at the same thing, but you can look at it from the concave side or from the convex side. What Breuer meant to say is, implicitly, if we could be aware of our whole mental whatever, there would be a one-to-one correspondence between things we think and we whatever feel and so forth, and events, physical events in the brain, and the other way around. So, and now if we want to say, well, why did these and these physical processes occur in the brain? It would be completely legitimate to say, because this was an idea.
Mhm.
I had this idea, and that's why this process, that's the explanation. Because you won't find any simple explanation. The simple explanation was, I had this idea, therefore the brain does this. That doesn't mean, however, that the idea acts on the brain.
Mhm.
This is a different, right? This is a different concept.
Yes.
It's a concept of a correspondence. So you really, when you say I have an idea, and somebody says, well, there's strange process going on in the brain, you may be talking about this, you may be talking about the same thing, but with different, different language. That's sort of the way I'm because this is really very troubling, right? This dualism.
Right.
But I find that a more satisfactory. There may be things that there may be events in the brain you can understand better from a purely physical standpoint, right? Like an electron that moves, and things that you could really only understand from the standpoint that that there are ideas going on. You say, well, the idea is really the cause, just as the cause is why I opened the door. I opened the door because I wanted to go out, not because there were some neurons, right? So anyway, that's the way I would think of that.
Right. Socrates actually approaches that question a little bit in the Phaedo as well.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, before going on to the next question, I was just wondering, the school of psychologists or philosophers that you were just referencing, would that by chance have anything to do with the Gestalt psychology school of Curler and Max Wertheimer and
I think Curler is, just hang on a second. I'm looking at I have it here. I have to look at my article. No, Curler is later, but certainly I think maybe one generation later, but they overlap.
Okay.
No, these are people like Hering, like Herbart, who was very important for Riemann. No, I've forgotten. I can give you a reference to them. They're people that thought that were very in this tradition of Naturphilosophie, that were trying to get a philosophical way to think about these scientific questions, sort of a philosophical worldview. Wonderfully rich and relevant. No, but most of that sort of gotten washed away. And I think that the Gestalt, the original Gestalt concept, Curler, is very much shaped by that.
Okay.
Later, very, very early, Breuer went his own way. He didn't agree with Freud. He found Freud too reductionistic. And I was very interested to study the patient, the first hysteria patient. I forgot her name. This is a very brilliant person who wrote poetry, was actually a kind of a feminist, but from my view, positive feminism. I think there's a lot of feminist stuff that I think is terrible, but she didn't call herself a feminist, but fought for right to vote, for all of these things, and was a tremendous thinker. Anyway, that's sort of in that sense, their therapy was successful.
At crushing that spirit, you mean, or at?
No, in actually liberating her. She obviously had a
okay.
problem, right? No, she went on then to be a very productive person, very productive, effective person.
Interesting. Yeah, there's definitely, I'd like to know more about that. All right, so the next, we had on the list here, Peter. Now, Peter just sent a message saying he must leave all of 3 minutes ago. He mentioned this. He also wrote in his message saying, I'll write something about my question and send it to me to send to you. But he wanted me to point out, it's a very interesting talk. He's been following Herr Tenenbaum and have read all of his articles about AI and fusion. He's very grateful. So, Peter, are you still there by chance? I'll just throw out one chance for you to get on. Okay, I think he did leave. All right. So the next up,
is he in Germany?
No, he's in Toronto.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So next up we have Pascal.
Hi, Jonathan.
Hello? Yeah, hi.
I'm gonna try to turn on my video 1 sec. Might not be super good. Start video. Okay, well, it's been a long time. I don't see my video starting. Sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So yeah, well, great lecture. I really appreciated it. There were many questions that popped into my mind while you were discussing AI and all this. And, you know, you mentioned at a certain point, you know, there was problem with mathematics and the limits to it. And I was brought back to, you know, Riemann's habilitation dissertation. It really made me think about this in the last statement where he says that, you know, the whole, well, I'm just going to give the title. It's on the hypothesis which underlie the basis of geometry.
Right.
And at the end of his paper, he said, well, you know, throughout this paper, he says that there was something clogging science and mathematics for a long time, and geometry, and the view of geometry since from Euclid to Laplace. And at the end, he says that this leads us into the domain of another science, physics. And the way you were discussing AI, I was really, I don't know if you mentioned it because I might have missed some parts of the lecture, especially the beginning. But it really triggered this question in my mind of, you know, if there was a problem with geometry because of mathematics, you know, the idea of going into physics to solve that problem. Now with AI, you know, you said that there's this question of understanding life and cognition, you know, the noetic principle. It's more, I guess, it's not really such a question, but it's more a comment. That's what it made me think of. And I wanted to know, you know, how you would approach these, you know, how do we study life today and understand that it's not the creation of a computer?
Yeah. I think you put your finger on something very, very important. There you are, Fechner. May have actually been Fechner, but Fechner was one of the people. I'm sorry, I'm seeing that was something that Bob just wrote. Fechner was one of the people that cited in my paper, or quoted in my paper. Don't know if he's the one that made this concave convex notion. Anyway, coming back to Riemann, I think you put your finger on something very, very important. That Riemann says at the end, he says that he wants to prevent that the progress of knowledge would be blocked by, I can't remember now his expression, but as I put it right now, by the a too narrow set of concepts, what he calls hypotheses. And he's doing exactly in this paper what I was trying to get at. In a sense, Kant also does that. I'm not saying that Kant is sort of was in our former association, Kant was a bad guy. more or less, or terrible. I think that's really not really useful. But in all the people, when you say critique der reinen Vernunft, the critique of reason, there is an element there, which Riemann expresses there, namely what you call the sort of reflective element. What is the basis is to look and say, what are the concepts that I'm using right now? Are the concepts moving me, or am I moving the concepts? Am I working in a self, in a bubble of my own concepts? Is there something that I have to add? No, am I being constrained, and so forth? So, and to focus attention, what are the hypotheses upon which geometry is, and then Riemann says at the beginning, says, these are not necessary Euclidean axioms, but they are hypotheses. What does that mean? They're hypotheses about the real world, right? They're hypotheses not in the sense that the real world is either Euclidean or non-Euclidean. They're hypotheses in the sense that of the issue is that, are these given hypotheses adequate as for conceptualizing or making progress in conceptualizing reality, right? And so, and in mathematics, I think in his this remark that you quoted or you referred to, where he goes off into another area of physics, I think you can get a clarification of concepts, an analysis of concepts, which he makes, which is not really mathematics. The mathematics is a byproduct of that, right? If you have other concepts, the concepts of another type of geometry, then you create, certain kind of mathematical. I don't want to use the word structure. That's such a terrible word. But a language, yeah, a language. But then you with a language alone, you don't get knowledge about the world, or at least very limited. So then you want to go out and yeah, I think therefore, and I've gotten away from your. So I think in that sense, your comment is very much to the point in terms of scientific method. And the answer, just like Riemann says, is a process that's continuing in a certain sense with the Einstein relativity. It never really this Riemann impulse took a very limited, it was only really, that's why I was very much attracted to this idea of Lynn LaRouche and of the idea of Cantor and Riemann. In other words, this notion of an evolutionary geometry and of a arrow, you might say, as some people say, a process which you can conceptualize of a series of series is all, again, gets a little bit algorithmic but at least the kind of ordering that's a very attractive and I think in a certain sense necessary direction, but it hasn't happened. We don't have this kind of physics. No, you can't, maybe you can't sort of just jump, into the stratosphere when you have a lot of unfinished business already in the quantum physics, already in some very concrete areas where you need to, where you can't get further really with generalities. You have to attach it, as Riemann said, right? You have to go out, you have to, yeah. Anyway, that's what I would say to that. Which is a good point.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have, I think, two concluding contributions here before we close it up for today. John has a follow-up question or comment from his previous thought. And John, if you could take yourself, if you're able to put your video on, that's great, but you can go for it.
I'm in the kitchen, the light's not as good. Yeah, I was thinking about this, a couple of quotes that I remembered. And, so there was this quite famous guy who worked in he was at the Manhattan Project, and then he did lots of pranks and stuff. Richard Feynman.
Yeah.
And so on his, he published a 3-volume thing, the Feynman Lectures.
Yeah, I know it very well. I read them.
And so one of the
not all of them actually. I read volume 2. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Yeah.
So during one of these lectures, of course, these lectures were attended by real students.
Yeah.
They didn't have the pandemic going on.
Right.
And so at one point, one student asked, "So what does this mean?" And Feynman just went white in the face and completely blew up.
Mm-hmm.
In science, we do not talk about meaning.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So in other words, one of the most successful from a political and prestige point of view scientists of the 20th century completely missed the boat.
Mm-hmm.
But it gets worse. A certain Eric Schmidt, CEO of Google for close to 10 years, who was, I found out just today that he was one of the authors of the Lex program that we still use for producing finite state machines for parsing trivial grammars. Science is finished. AI will take over.
Yeah.
So this, I think that quote summarizes the title of your talk.
Yeah. If I might just comment, Feynman.
There's a couple of comments. I'm done.
Go.
Thank you very much for your talk.
Oh, thanks. Feynman is really, for me, he's a disaster of a specific sort, because he's very refreshing, and in a certain way, from his personality, he has something very, very positive in the certain polemic that he makes, and certain honesty that he has. I mean, at least to a certain extent. Very informal person, very, and he excited students greatly, because it was not the stale, European professor, Dr. HCHH, but it was informal, it was person to person. So it had tremendously positive aspects. So I think that you can really say. But there's a problem. From my standpoint, that is, he was in a certain sense anti-philosophical. It was a break from the more European, humanistic tendency of science. It's understandable because of where he came out with what's happened to physics. He was honest. He said, just quantum mechanics is just, it's crazy. It's not understandable. He said it, Heisenberg said the same thing. But then he got into some sophism. He didn't allow himself to say, well, maybe we can make it intelligible. Maybe we can come, because he was one of these geniuses that was so good at solving the problems that he didn't seem to have the patience. And this is also very difficult. Not everybody wants to do this. The patience, instead of roaring ahead with his Feynman diagrams and his action integrals and all these fantastic things, he did this formulation, what you call action integral formulation of quantum mechanics, is fantastic, beautiful. But the problem with the physics and the atmosphere that they were in, it was not just him, you know. I knew Freeman Dyson, and I never met Feynman, but I knew some of the physicists in that area. Is they're sort of like like runners that are running at supersonic speed. And now you say, well, could you please change your shoes? They're not going to stop. That's not their thing, right? So he didn't, unfortunately, he was not a deep philosophical thinker at all. He was in a certain sense an American type, in the sense of the Americans always say, this philosophy. I mean, he didn't, we're not going to, all the Europeans, they're all full of all this stuff. We're going to do and make it work. So it has a certain positive American impulse and a certain stupid, from my standpoint, real stupid and damaging, because it goes exactly away from this more reflective, and in this particular point of the quantum physics, I mean, he did think about it a lot. A lot of these people really tried to, and Einstein and Planck and so on, they really tried to get further with the quantum physics to make it intelligible, because it's not intelligible. So either you give up the intelligibility, stop thinking stupid, calculate, right? Learn how to calculate with it, right? And then Feynman, of course, had his intuition, all the things that physicists have, good ones, right? But in terms of what this damn thing really means, no. So I found that, Schmidt, I don't know, but I think you're completely right. We have these culture has gone, well, let me just finish. Let me say I'm optimistic, actually, in a certain way, because I do see, God has his ways. I do see signs, despite all of this problem, signs of some thinking going on, serious thinking going on, beside all of this other stuff. So, plus you have some very good technology. And even if the technology is based on a flawed, epistemological base. So when I say, well, okay, well, if you can use, like molecular biology, I think it's a completely wrong mindset about the way life works. But it's useful as a tool. It is useful. So it's like chemistry, right? It's useful. So we don't have to make a big deal out of it. It only becomes a problem if you say, that's it, that's the secret of life, right? And then you've really screwed things up, right? But I'm optimistic that a lot of this stuff is just, get a couple of generations maybe, and people start to maybe think about these things, and you can pose a lot of these questions in quantum physics in a different way that are no longer not thought experiments anymore, right? You can do a lot of things that we can, that were just purely theoretical before. So I'm optimistic in that way, yeah.
Okay, we have one last contribution from David, who had graced us with a class a couple of weeks ago on Nicholas of Cusa, where some of the ideas that you've introduced today. It's recorded up on our website, and yeah, the idea of AI was played with a little bit there. Now David is the editor of a classical poetry revival website called Chain News, so I think he might have something useful to say about some of these ideas that were floating around today. David, why don't you go for it?
Hey, I apologize. The light is terrible. Jeez. Thank you for the class. That was great. And yeah, I think this AI question is really important, especially in terms of how it's playing out in the political sphere as well. I had watched this presentation, and I played clips from it in the class on Cusa from Yuval Harari. Have you heard of this guy? He's a philosopher.
Yeah.
That, yeah, he's written Homo Deus, you know, it's all about AI, sort of the fourth industrial revolution, AI taking over. He's saying there's the new problem of it's going to create this new global useless class. And how do we deal with this new global useless class as AI is going to sort of take over most human functions, which implies all sorts of, you know, very terrible things about, well, how do we view human beings such that we think they can be replaced with machines? But to reduce some really big, long, winding thoughts into just a few simple thoughts. When I was doing the class, I got sucked into the whole quantum mechanics. I needed to know about it all only to end up not talking about it, but to know that it was what it was. And it's this whole idea of particle, self-evident particle versus states of being. And, you know, if we're thinking, if there's no, instead of getting away from this object fixation that there are these particles, right, instead of singularities and states of organization, then I was thinking about the mind as well. Like, even when we say we have a new thought, is it really just this individual new thought? Or is is that thought just embodying a different state of mind, a different state of organization? And what's primary is the state of organization. And if we think like that, it changes everything, number one. And it seems to also, it poses a new set of questions. Like, we're going to want to do more experiments test different boundary conditions, right? We see what happens under in different situations. And I mean, that's also what creativity is, right? A thought experiment. Every new idea comes from us just sort of wandering with some sense of intent, but ultimately it's that state of mind of going where you don't know and seeing what's going to pop up. And that's really, I mean, science as well. It seems that's a much more humble way to approach the question of experimentation and just ideas, that we start with these states and we experiment and find out what new states we'll be in. But we don't have this whole particle, the position, right? The position of the particle, which is what drives everybody crazy. But we don't need to get driven crazy by that if we're thinking about it from the standpoint of a process and really verbs instead of nouns, right? The action, the intellect itself. Is it a thing or is it really an action? Is a thought really ever still? Is a particle really ever still? Is there such thing as just these isolated, motionless things? Or are thoughts, like in a sense particles too, they only exist as an action, as a quality of organization? So yeah, I just wanted to
I think, yeah, I mean, again, you know, the notion of bodies that have positions is to a certain extent imposed upon us, or is very natural because of the stars and the planets, right? It's not, let's put it this way, it's like everything else, like you say, it's always a question, what is primary in your mind? You say, okay, we have the moon, we have the earth, we have the sun, right? Those are objects. Well, but what does it mean, an object? So the question is, how do we think about it? You can think about it. Well, what I'm trying to get is the following. You have a kind of general attitude, what you're just describing. Look at things not as positions, look at them as states. So you're talking then, therefore, it's not just the moon, but it's a certain state, an orbit, like Kepler, right? Who made the orbit more fundamental than the planet and its position, right? So you have a kind of a mindset. On the other hand, I don't want to throw away the fact that as an astronomer, I measure positions, right? Otherwise I can't do anything. I'm just talking. And I say state, fine. Where you do have very interesting problems with states is exactly right now on solid state physics, but also a very fascinating area of biology, which was called, actually it was chemistry, called colloidal chemistry, where there's a fellow named, what's his name now? I have his book here. Anyway, I can see. There's a revival of what used to be called the protoplasmic concept of biology, which is exactly what you're saying, is an idea that's not molecular biology. It doesn't start with the molecules. It starts with states, exactly what you're saying, and starts with the idea you have what was called in German Aggregationszustände. There were states of organization. So you can go from liquid to solid, you can go from liquid to gas, but actually the substance in the cell has an infinite number of different states of being, right? So, and we don't have words for them. So we can find now maybe correlations to these phase changes, right? So you're moving from, right, when you have a liquid which is crystallizing, you have a change in organization, which is not one molecule doing something, but it's a global, holistic, you might say, transformation from one mode to another mode, like we say in music, we have modulation, right? So and then you have what you're saying, of course, that you say, well, state is also a little bit static. What we want to really talk about is processes, a process that goes from one state to another, right? And then we have really a problem. How can you conceptualize a process? Well, actually, we do it all the time without really, but how can you conceptualize a process which you see for the first time? And by one of the big problems I've read about the automatic, what is called autonomic driving vehicles, right, which has come up, which is a very big problem, is even if you get the system to recognize an object, like a woman with a baby carriage, right? The system doesn't see what's going on. Does the woman want to cross the street with a baby carriage, right? Is the baby crying and the woman's not going to cross the street? In other words, what is the process that's going on? So, and that is a whole other dimension where AI really is really almost nowhere, right? To even, I'm talking pragmatically as a, and I think that's where you get into these things of poetry, language, because I didn't mention that, but for me, it's very, very important, is that language is always dance, poetry, and singing. There's always a muscular aspect. Of course, when you learn to sit, and I'm not sitting around, I'm gesticulating, I'm not dancing, but it's all part of the process. There's no, you're always, all language, all thinking is muscular in a sense, right? So what I mean by that is this process, what you're calling the process aspect, is intrinsic. Just like if you listen to children talk, they're singing. You only learn when you get when you grow up, you learn to speak in monotone. But no child, they all have natural prosody, natural musical form of speaking. That's all in the domain of getting away from what you're saying, this static, combinatorial, discrete, approach to a more synthetic one, which has process as primary. And the question is then, okay, well, that's good. And practically speaking, I'm writing a continuation on Chomsky because they're also a disaster king because he's a very bright person, but Chomsky's linguistics is for me really a disaster, in the sense of you have somebody who had a lot of insight, particularly against Skinner. That was his probably the real contribution of him. He actually defeated. It seems to have knocked Skinner out of the linguistic area. So it was a knockout punch. What he did after that is a disaster. But this notion that he put in that language is basically grammar, right? It's crazy. Language always goes from meaning to form, right? It doesn't go from grammar out. It goes, the form, the idea generates, as in poetry, right? The poetic concept generates the form. I mean, generally speaking, I guess you would agree.
There's one more. The only, as I hear what you're saying, and I've been thinking about the same thing, the other L is intention.
Yeah.
And Leibniz's least action principle,
Mm-hmm.
that's the one that I can see driving everybody nuts, really nuts. But it makes sense for the example of the lady crossing, right? There's the process, but even more specifically, the question is, what's her intention?
Right.
As this state of organization, and even with matter, right? Like, how much does this question of the least action principle, as Leibniz talks about it with light, how much is it play into all these different states of matter? And like, if we were thinking in terms of least action principle, we could hypothesize about, well, what would necessarily be the quickest way for things to reach this and that state? But the idea of intention sort of changes everything. Grammar as well. Like, it's about the intention. How do you think of that in terms of physics? It's quite something.
Did you have to just go out and try these things out, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. The universe is there so that we can try things out, and see how ideas, where ideas will take us. Yeah, I think you're right. I just think
we need to try stuff.
Yeah, just try stuff. That's it's play, right? And I've gotten more, let's say, more in this mode of connecting up with work that's actually going on in different areas of science, and not starting, this is my own personal thing, it's not necessarily starting with an epistemological critique, but asking myself, I do that vis-a-vis my own thinking, but ask myself, okay, what is fruitful, right? What are signs of interesting possibilities? Because I've come to realize better that science is what you call in German a Handwerk. The great sciences, whether it be Gauss or Riemann, so we're virtuosos in the nuts and bolts of the fields that they were working in, just as Beethoven was a virtuoso pianist, and not somebody who's just flying around with big ideas, but he was one of the most competent in every area of the technique of piano playing. So I say that simply because one needs a kind of cooperation, social process, where one has to be able to work with the people who have these, feet on the ground, so one can actually one can make some progress, which gets us beyond an impulse, what you call an intention, right? And actually create something which is in the basis for going further, right? So I think that's what you're saying about states and so forth. I've been thinking about that there would be a lot of room for that in, Pollock is the name, the biologist, who's getting in that direction of trying to characterize states of the interior material of a cell.
Oh, is he the guy who did the fourth phase of water work?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, he has a book called Cells, Gels, and no, he's a funny guy. He's but he's part of this tradition, right? I would just say no. It's the states that are manipulating the molecules, right? In other words, the changes of state is steering the chemical processes, not the other way around. Yeah, and the cell is acting by phase changes. Very, very beautiful, and I hope and fruitful kind of an idea.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for devoting your time and energy and creative thought to this whole experience. This has been very enriching, and hopefully we can do more in the upcoming months ahead. There's so many ideas that have been introduced that I'm sure can just continuously be developed upon.
Well, thank you very much. It's very stimulating, and it's wonderful to exchange ideas. And I'm also regret that I'm under enormous amount of time pressure these days, and that prevents me from taking part more than I hope to be able to do so more in the future. But that's at the moment, so really. But the time here was very well spent, I think, and I'm very, very gratified. So thank you very much.
Okay, and for everyone, we're going to continue this process next Sunday at 4 p.m. The host of SOT's Mind Matters, Harrison Coyley, will be giving a presentation introducing some ideas that will touch upon Leibniz's monadology. We'll deal with some idea called panpsychism and ponerology. So it should be an interesting set of ideas that will, I'm sure, inspire some good conversations. So next week, 4 p.m. And thank you, everyone, for showing up today.